The spotlight hit Florence Hail's face as the entire Grand Royale ballroom waited in silence. New York's most powerful mafia boss stood beside her, jaw clenched, fists trembling. The woman in the simple black dress had just shattered her champagne glass against marble floors on purpose. Every billionaire, politician, and crime lord in the room stared at her like she'd lost her mind. They whispered, they laughed, they waited for her humiliation. But Florence smiled calmly because she knew something they didn't. In exactly 14 minutes, every person who mocked the bookstore girl would regret underestimating the mafia boss's wife. If you want to see how this story ends, stay with me until the final moment. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The marriage announcement hit New York's underground empire like a grenade 3 months before the gala. Damian Moretti, the untouchable crime lord who controlled half the city from penthouse boardrooms and blood-soaked back alleys, was getting married. Not to a senator's daughter, not to old money royalty, not to some Instagram model with 10 million followers and a cocaine problem, to Florence Hail, a nobody. The media tore into her immediately. Mafia boss marries bookstore clerk, Damian Moretti's midlife crisis. From Brooklyn basement to billionaire bedroom, the gold digger's guide. Tabloid photographers camped outside the small bookstore in Williamsburg where Florence worked 6 days a week. They shoved cameras in her face while she carried coffee. They screamed questions while she unlocked the shop at 7 in the morning. They published photos of her worn-out sneakers and faded jeans like evidence of fraud. Florence ignored all of it. She didn't give interviews, didn't post on social media, didn't hire publicists or stylists or crisis managers. She just kept selling books to neighborhood kids and restocking poetry shelves like nothing had changed. That drove the vultures crazier. Because in a world where everyone performed for attention, Florence's silence felt like an insult. The wedding itself happened quietly in a private courthouse with no guests, no cameras, no champagne towers. Just Damian in a black suit and Florence in a simple cream dress that cost $80 from a department store. His mother refused to attend. His business associates sent expensive gifts with passive-aggressive cards. The entire city waited for the marriage to collapse within 6 months. But Damian didn't care what anyone thought, because the first time he met Florence, she'd looked directly into the eyes of the most feared man in New York and told him his French pronunciation was terrible. That moment haunted him. Domites. It happened 8 months before the wedding inside a rare bookstore in the West Village. Damian walked in alone. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars. He was looking for a first-edition copy of The Count of Monte Cristo for a French arms dealer he needed to impress. The shop smelled like old paper and lemon wood polish. Florence stood behind the counter organizing invoices, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, reading glasses sliding down her nose. She wore a faded Howard University sweatshirt and looked up when the bell above the door chimed. "We're closing in 10 minutes, she said without looking at him. Damian wasn't used to people not recognizing him. "I'm looking for something specific," he replied. "Aren't we all?" Florence still didn't glance up from her paperwork. Damian's jaw tightened. He walked deeper into the store, scanning shelves packed floor to ceiling with leather spines and gold lettering. Most women melted when he entered a room. This one acted like he was interrupting her grocery list. "Do you have any Dumas?" he asked. "Third aisle, top shelf, left side." Damian found the book within 2 minutes. A beautiful 1846 French edition with embossed lettering. He brought it to the counter and set it down carefully. Florence finally looked up. She didn't react to his face, didn't recognize the man every newspaper in New York called a monster. She just picked up the book, examined the spine, and quoted him a price that made his eyebrow raise. "That's double what it's worth," Damian said quietly. "Then don't buy it." Florence started wrapping the book anyway. "You always this pleasant with customers?" "Only the ones who walk in 9 minutes before closing and expect me to smile about it." Damian almost laughed. Almost. "You know who I am?" he asked. Florence looked at him properly for the first time. Her eyes moved across his face with the detached curiosity of someone studying a painting in a museum. No fear, no attraction, just mild interest. "Should I?" she asked. "Most people do. Most people watch too much TV." She slid the wrapped book across the counter. Cash or card? Damien pulled out his wallet and handed her a black credit card that had no spending limit. While she processed the payment, he noticed a small stack of foreign language books beside the register. Camus in French, Dante in Italian, Goethe in German. You read all those? He asked. Why else would I own them? In the original languages? Translations kill poetry. Florence handed back his card. Your book. Damien picked up the package but didn't leave immediately. What's your name? He asked. Florence. Just Florence? Unless you're planning to stalk me, first names are sufficient. This time Damien did smile. Small. Dangerous. I'm looking for someone who can translate a letter from French, he said. Business correspondence, confidential. Are you interested? Florence studied him for 3 long seconds. How confidential? She asked. The kind where discretion pays extremely well. And if I say no, then you say no. Damien pulled a business card from his jacket and set it on the counter. But I pay better than this bookstore ever will. He walked out before she could respond. Florence stared at the card for a long time after he left. Plain black cardstock, white lettering, just a phone number, no name, no company, no explanation. She should have thrown it away immediately. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket. Florence called the number 3 days later. Not because she needed money, though her student loans were drowning her and the bookstore paid minimum wage. She called because something about Damien Moretti's eyes stayed with her. Most powerful men looked at women like acquisitions, like trophies to collect or obstacles to remove. Damien looked at her like she was a problem he couldn't solve, and Florence had always been dangerously attracted to impossible problems. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. State your business. I'm calling about translation work, Florence said carefully. Name. Florence Hail. Silence. Then keyboard clicking. You'll receive an address in 60 seconds. Be there tomorrow at 7 p.m. Come alone. Bring identification. The line went dead. Florence stared at her phone. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane. You didn't meet strange men in undisclosed locations for cash-paid translation jobs. That's how people ended up on true crime podcasts. But the next evening, Florence found herself standing outside a luxury high-rise in Tribeca, wearing her only professional outfit, black slacks and a white button-down that still had a coffee stain on the sleeve she couldn't completely remove. The doorman didn't ask questions, just checked her ID and directed her to a private elevator that required a keycard. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors, furniture that cost more than her entire childhood apartment. Everything cold and sharp and expensive. Damien stood near the window with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian to someone who was clearly terrified of him. Florence waited silently. When Damien finally ended the call, he turned around and looked at her like he'd forgotten she was coming. You actually showed up, he said. You actually thought I wouldn't? Most people are smarter than that. Florence set her bag down on the glass coffee table. What do you need translated? Damien crossed the room and handed her a folder containing 3 handwritten letters in elegant French script. Florence skimmed the first page, and her expression didn't change, but her pulse spiked. The letters detailed arms shipments, offshore accounts, and something about a politician's blackmail arrangement. She looked up at Damien. You're aware this is evidence of about 15 felonies, she said calmly. I'm aware. Damien poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. Still interested? Florence should have walked out immediately. Should have called the police, should have protected herself. Instead, she sat down and started translating. For the next 3 hours, Florence worked while Damien made phone calls in 4 different languages, occasionally glancing at her like he was waiting for her to panic. She never did. When Florence finally finished, she handed him the translated documents and stated her price, triple what any professional translator would charge. Damien didn't blink. Done, he said. You'll have the money tomorrow. Florence stood to leave. You're not afraid of me, Damien said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Florence paused near the elevator. Should I be? She asked. Yes. Why? Because I'm the kind of man who destroys people for looking at me wrong. Florence turned around and met his eyes directly. Then I'll make sure not to look at you wrong, she said. Something shifted in Damien's expression. something dangerous and fascinated. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he said quietly. "Most days I'm both." Florence stepped into the elevator. "Good night, Mr. Moretti." The doors closed before he could respond. Damien stood alone in his penthouse, staring at the empty elevator for a long time. Every woman in his world either wanted something from him or feared him. Florence Hail did neither, and that made her the most dangerous person he'd ever met. Back. The translation jobs continued for 3 months. Once a week, Florence would arrive at Damien's penthouse with her coffee-stained sleeve and worn-out laptop. She'd translate letters, contracts, intercepted communications. All of it illegal, all of it dangerous, none of it fazing her. Damien paid her obscene amounts of money. Florence never asked what the documents were for. That unspoken arrangement became its own kind of intimacy. Sometimes Damien would pour her wine while she worked. Sometimes he'd sit across from her in silence, watching her eyes move across foreign sentences like she was decoding the universe. They barely spoke about personal things, but slowly, carefully, something built between them. One night, Florence arrived to find Damien standing at the window with his tie loosened and whiskey in his hand, staring at the city like it owed him answers. "Bad day?" Florence asked quietly. "Someone I trusted tried to kill me this morning," Damien replied without turning around. Florence set her bag down slowly. "Did you kill them back?" she asked. "Not yet." "Will you?" "Probably." Florence walked over and stood beside him at the window. The city glittered below them like broken glass. "Does it ever bother you?" she asked. "The violence." Damien finally looked at her. "Does translating my crimes ever bother you?" he countered. "Every single time." "Then why do you keep coming back?" Florence was quiet for a long moment. "Because I grew up watching powerful people crush everyone around them," she said finally, "and I wanted to understand what that kind of power actually costs." Damien's jaw tightened. "And what have you learned?" he asked. Florence met his eyes. "That the most dangerous men in the world are the loneliest," she whispered. Something cracked in Damien's expression. He kissed her, hard, desperate, like he was trying to prove she was wrong. Florence kissed him back, not because she was afraid, not because he paid her, because somewhere between French letters and blood-stained contracts, she'd stopped seeing the monster everyone else feared. She saw the man underneath, and that terrified her more than anything. They didn't talk about the kiss. Florence showed up the following week like nothing happened. Damien acted the same, but everything had shifted. 2 months later, Damien asked her to marry him, not with roses or champagne or a ring worth 6 figures. He asked her at 3 a.m. after she'd fallen asleep on his couch, translating German financial records. Florence woke up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Marry me," he said quietly. Florence blinked. "What?" "Marry me." "Damien, I know what I am," he interrupted. "I know what my world is. I know I'm asking you to step into something dark and dangerous and fucked up." He leaned forward. "But I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who either fear me or want something from me," Damien continued. "And you're the only person who's ever looked at me like I'm just human." Florence's throat tightened. "This is insane," she whispered. "I know. Your family will hate me. I know. The entire city will destroy me. I know." Damien reached for her hand. "But I don't care about any of that. I care about you." Florence stared at their joined hands. Every logical part of her brain screamed to run, but her heart, her stupid, reckless heart, whispered something else entirely. "Okay," she said. Damien froze. "Okay?" he repeated. "Okay." Florence smiled despite the tears in her eyes. "I'll marry you." Damien pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only solid thing in his entire collapsing world. And for the first time in 20 years, the most feared man in New York felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. The wedding was quiet. The aftermath was chaos. Damien's mother called Florence a manipulative opportunist. His business partners questioned his judgment publicly. The media turned Florence into a punchline, the poor girl who seduced a billionaire. Strangers sent her death threats on social media. Former lovers of Damien's posted revenge stories to tabloids, and Florence handled all of it with terrifying calm. She didn't fight back, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. She just kept living her life. Damien, however, was ready to burn the city down. "Let me handle this," he growled one night while reading another vicious article about Florence. "No," Florence said simply. "They're calling you a whore." "I know." "Florence, Damien." She took the tablet from his hands. "If you destroy everyone who insults me, you'll prove them right. They'll say I turned you weak, that I'm controlling you." "I don't care what they say." "I do." Florence cupped his face. "I married you knowing exactly what your world looks like, but I won't let that world turn me into something I'm not." Damien's hands trembled against her waist. "I can't just let them hurt you," he whispered. "Then don't." Florence smiled. "Let me handle them my way." "Which is?" "Patience." Damien didn't understand. Not yet, but he would. The Moretti Foundation Gala arrived like a reckoning. It was the biggest social event of the year, a glittering spectacle where New York's wealthiest criminals pretended to be philanthropists for one night. Politicians, businessmen, crime lords, billionaires. Everyone who mattered would be there. And this year, for the first time, Florence would appear publicly as Damien's wife. The sharks were already circling. Vivian DeLuca, the ruthless ex-wife of a casino magnate, had been calling reporters for weeks, promising that Florence Moretti would be exposed at the gala. Vincent Carrington, a nightclub owner with ties to Damien's empire, had been spreading rumors that the marriage was already falling apart. Others simply waited with champagne and cruelty, ready to watch the bookstore girl humiliate herself in front of New York's elite. Florence knew all of this. She'd heard the whispers, read the articles, seen the social media posts, and she'd been preparing. Not with stylists or publicists or expensive gowns, with something far more dangerous. The truth. The night before the gala, Florence sat in Damien's study going over the speech she'd written for the literacy program announcement. Damien leaned against the doorway watching her. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Florence looked up. "Yes, I do," she replied. "Why?" "Because every person in that ballroom thinks I'm weak." Florence set down her notes. "And I need them to understand who I actually am before they try to destroy me." Damien crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "And who are you?" he asked softly. Florence smiled. "Someone who refuses to be small just to make other people comfortable." Damien kissed her forehead. And the next evening, Florence walked into the Grand Royale ballroom wearing a simple black dress and no jewelry except her wedding ring. The whispers started immediately. "That's what she's wearing. She looks like a waitress." Poor Damien. Florence ignored all of it. She walked beside her husband with her head high and her expression calm. And when she reached the champagne tower near the main ballroom entrance, she picked up a crystal glass. Then she deliberately let it fall. The glass shattered against the marble floor with a sound like thunder. The entire ballroom went silent. Every eye turned toward her. Florence smiled, because in exactly 14 minutes, she was about to give a speech that would change everything. And nobody in that room had any idea what was coming. The champagne glass shattered like a gunshot. Crystal shards scattered across marble floors in a perfect radius around Florence's feet. The sound echoed through the Grand Royale ballroom with the kind of finality that made conversations die mid-sentence. Florence didn't move. She stood perfectly still while 300 of New York's most powerful people stared at her like she'd just committed a crime. The whispers started immediately. She dropped her drink? How clumsy. This is embarrassing. Beside her, Damien's entire body went rigid. His hand moved instinctively toward her elbow, protective and tense. But Florence touched his wrist gently. A silent message. Not yet. Across the ballroom, Vivian DeLuca's lips curved into a smile sharp enough to draw blood. She leaned toward the woman beside her, some senator's wife dripping in diamonds, and whispered something that made them both laugh behind their champagne flutes. Florence heard every word. Poor thing can't even hold a glass properly. A server rushed over with a towel and dustpan, apologizing profusely while cleaning the mess. Florence thanked him quietly. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She just smiled, like breaking expensive crystal in front of New York's elite was exactly what she'd planned to do. Because it was. Damien's jaw tightened dangerously as he scanned the room. He knew every face here, knew which ones were laughing, which ones were judging, which ones were already composing text messages to gossip columnists about his wife's embarrassing public failure. "Say the word," Damien whispered against Florence's ear, "and I'll make them all regret it." Florence turned to look at him. "No," she said softly. "Let them laugh." "Florence, trust me." Something in her eyes stopped his protest cold. Damien had built an empire on reading people, on knowing when someone was lying, when they were scared, when they were about to betray him. But Florence's expression revealed nothing except calm certainty. So he nodded once, and decided to let his wife play whatever game she was playing, even though every instinct screamed that the wolves were closing in. Wonk. Dinner was announced 20 minutes later. The ballroom's main dining hall glittered like something out of a nightmare disguised as a dream. Crystal chandeliers hung from 30-foot ceilings. Gold-trimmed plates sat on tables draped in ivory silk. Each centerpiece cost more than most people's monthly rent. Florence and Damien were seated at the head table, which meant they were surrounded by the absolute worst people in the room. To Florence's left sat Vincent Carrington, the nightclub owner who'd been telling anyone who'd listen that Damien's marriage was a midlife crisis wrapped in desperation. Vincent was 43, handsome in the way expensive personal trainers and good cocaine could manufacture, and absolutely furious that Damien had married someone outside their world. To her right sat Senator Patricia Owens, a politician so corrupt she made organized crime look honest by comparison. Across from Florence sat Vivian DeLuca and her current boyfriend, some tech billionaire 20 years younger than her who looked like he'd been purchased at an exclusive catalog. And beside Damien sat Marcus Chen, a cartel financier who laundered money through real estate developments and acted like philanthropy was the same as morality. Every single one of them looked at Florence like she was an insect that had crawled onto their expensive tablecloth. The first course arrived, some kind of foie gras situation that probably involved animal cruelty Florence didn't want to think about. Vincent picked up his wine glass and smiled at Florence with all the warmth of a snake evaluating prey. "So, Florence," he said loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Damien tells us you designed the literacy program we're announcing tonight." Florence set down her fork carefully. "I did," she replied. "How fascinating." Vincent's smile widened. "And what exactly qualifies you to design a global education initiative?" The table went quiet. Even the servers slowed down. Damien's hand tightened around his steak knife hard enough that his knuckles turned white. Florence touched his knee under the table. Another silent warning. Then she looked directly at Vincent. "I grew up poor," she said calmly, "so I understand what it's like when the world treats education like a luxury instead of a right." Vincent laughed. Not politely. Not quietly. He actually laughed out loud like Florence had told a joke. "That's adorable," he said. "But designing global programs requires expertise, connections, resources you simply don't have." "Vincent," Damien said quietly. The warning in his voice could have frozen lava, but Vincent either didn't notice or didn't care. "I'm just being honest," Vincent continued, swirling his wine. "Damien, you could have partnered with Harvard, Yale, Oxford, institutions with actual credibility. Instead, you're letting your wife play philanthropist like it's a hobby." Vivian smirked into her champagne. Senator Owens looked away uncomfortably. Marcus Chen stayed silent, but his expression said everything. Florence felt Damien's entire body coil like a predator about to strike. She knew that look, knew exactly what happened to people who disrespected Damien Moretti. Vincent Carrington was about to disappear from New York society, maybe permanently, unless Florence stopped it. "You're right," Florence said suddenly. Everyone at the table froze. Damien looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Vincent's eyebrows raised. "I'm sorry?" "You're right," Florence repeated. "I don't have the credentials of Harvard or Yale. I worked in a bookstore making minimum wage while paying off student loans. I'm not connected to old money or political dynasties." She set down her napkin. "But I also didn't need my father's law firm to get me into an Ivy League school," Florence continued, looking directly at Vincent, "or use Daddy's trust fund to buy my way into clubs I pretended to build from scratch." Vincent's face went pale, because Florence had just referenced something almost nobody knew. Vincent Carrington's entire empire was built on his father's money and connections. Every club, every investment, every success story, all of it came from a family fortune he'd spent 20 years pretending he'd earned himself. How do you... Vincent started. I read, Florence interrupted, and I pay attention. Two skills you might want to develop before questioning other people's qualifications. The table erupted into barely concealed shock. Vivian's smirk disappeared. Marcus Chen coughed into his napkin to hide a laugh. Even Senator Owens looked impressed despite herself. Damien stared at his wife like he'd never actually seen her before. Vincent's jaw worked soundlessly for 3 long seconds. Then he stood up abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered. He walked away from the table without another word. Silence settled over the remaining guests like snow. Finally, Vivian leaned forward with a smile that could cut glass. "Well," she purred, "that was entertaining." Florence picked up her fork and continued eating like nothing had happened, but under the table, her hands were shaking. The rest of dinner passed in tense, careful conversation. Nobody else directly challenged Florence, but the looks continued. The whispers continued. The judgment continued. Florence could feel it pressing against her skin like humidity before a storm. She'd won the first battle, but the war was far from over. After dinner, guests moved into the main ballroom for the speeches and announcements portion of the evening. Florence excused herself to the bathroom. She needed 60 seconds alone. 60 seconds to breathe. 60 seconds to remind herself why she was doing this. The bathroom was all marble and gold fixtures and mirrors that made everything look more expensive than it actually was. Florence leaned against the sink and stared at her reflection. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix. The kind that came from constantly defending your right to exist in spaces designed to exclude you. The door opened behind her. Vivian DeLuca walked in wearing a blood-red gown that probably cost more than a car. Florence's stomach dropped. "Well, well," Vivian said, pulling out lipstick from her clutch. "The bookstore girl has claws after all." Florence straightened but didn't respond. Vivian applied her lipstick slowly, deliberately, holding eye contact through the mirror. "You think embarrassing Vincent makes you one of us?" Vivian asked. "I don't want to be one of you," Florence replied quietly. "Good." Vivian capped her lipstick. "Because you never will be." She moved closer, too close, invading Florence's space with the kind of aggressive intimacy meant to intimidate. "Let me explain something to you," Vivian continued. "Damien is a fascinating man, powerful, dangerous, obscenely wealthy, and every woman in his world has wanted him at some point." Florence's jaw tightened. "But he's also a man who gets bored easily," Vivian whispered. "And when he gets bored, he moves on, usually violently." "Is there a point to this?" Florence asked. "The point is, you're temporary." Vivian smiled. "You're the midlife crisis, the rebellion against his mother's expectations, the authentic connection he thinks he needs before he realizes authenticity is just another word for boring." Florence turned to face her directly. "Are you finished?" she asked calmly. "Almost." Vivian's smile widened. "When Damien inevitably leaves you, and he will, don't expect anyone in this city to catch you, because we all know what you are." "And what's that?" "A nobody trying desperately to become a somebody by fucking the right man." The words hung in the air like poison. Florence could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. Every instinct screamed to defend herself, to fight back, to prove Vivian wrong. But she'd learned something important over the past 3 months. People like Vivian didn't actually want the truth. They wanted a reaction. So Florence smiled. "You know what I find interesting?" she said softly. "You've spent the last 5 minutes trying to convince me I don't belong in Damien's life. But if you actually believe that, you wouldn't need to say it out loud." Vivian's expression flickered. "You just wait for me to fail," Florence continued, "which means some part of you is afraid I won't." She picked up her clutch. "Good night, Vivian." Florence walked out of the bathroom before Vivian could respond. But her hands were shaking so badly she had to lean against the hallway wall for 10 full seconds just to steady herself. The speeches started at 8:30. The ballroom had been transformed into a theater-style setup with a raised stage, professional lighting, and cameras recording everything for the Foundation's social media. Florence sat in the front row beside Damien while various board members gave boring speeches about charitable tax deductions disguised as altruism. Damien's hand rested on her knee, partly affectionate, partly protective. "You okay?" he whispered during a particularly tedious presentation about donor recognition levels. Florence nodded. She wasn't okay, but she was holding it together. Finally, the MC announced Damien. The entire ballroom erupted into applause. Damien stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked onto the stage like he owned not just the room but the entire city, which, functionally, he did. His speech was short and strategic. He talked about education as economic investment, about literacy rates and workforce development, about the Moretti family's commitment to giving back to communities that built their success. All of it carefully worded to sound philanthropic, without admitting that those same communities had been destroyed by the Moretti Empire's criminal enterprises. Then Damien paused. The room went quiet. "This literacy program," he said slowly, "was not designed by our foundation's board. It wasn't created by Ivy League consultants or expensive think tanks." Florence's breath caught. "It was created by my wife." The whispers erupted immediately. Florence felt 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her like searchlights. "Florence spent 6 months researching education deserts in 12 countries," Damien continued. "She interviewed teachers, librarians, community organizers. She built a program designed specifically for children the world has forgotten." He extended his hand toward her. "Come join me." Florence's heart stopped. This wasn't part of the plan. They discussed the speech, agreed on the messaging, decided Florence would stay in the background while Damien did the public-facing work. But Damien was changing the script. Right now. In front of everyone. Florence stood slowly. Her legs felt like water. Every step toward that stage felt like walking toward her own execution. The ballroom lights were blinding. The cameras were everywhere. And 300 people who'd spent the entire night judging her were now watching her walk onto a stage she'd never wanted to be on. Damien took her hand and pulled her close. "Tell them," he whispered against her ear. Florence looked out at the sea of faces. Vivian sat in the third row with her arms crossed. Vincent had returned and stood near the back, expression unreadable. Senator Owens watched with the cold calculation of a politician evaluating potential threats. Marcus Chen leaned forward slightly, actually curious. And somewhere in that crowd were journalists, photographers, social media influencers, and people who would dissect every word Florence said for the next 72 hours. The microphone was in front of her. Damien stepped back slightly, giving her space, giving her control. Florence took a breath. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 16 years, she began. Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet, but the room was silent enough that everyone heard. Sometimes she worked 3 jobs at once, Florence continued. We lived in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn above a corner store that sold expired milk and lottery tickets. She gripped the microphone stand. We couldn't afford tutors or private schools or SAT prep courses, but libraries were free." Florence's throat tightened. "So I taught myself." Then she switched to French. Flawless, rapid French. She talked about poor children in Paris suburbs, about immigrant families in Marseille, about how poverty looked the same in every language. Several people in the audience straightened in shock. Florence switched to Italian, then German, then Mandarin. With each language, the ballroom grew quieter, more stunned, because the bookstore girl from Brooklyn was speaking 5 languages fluently in front of New York's elite who could barely order coffee in basic Spanish. Florence switched back to English. "I know what most of you think," she said, looking directly at the audience. "You think I married Damien for money, for power, for access to a world I didn't earn." Damien's expression darkened, but Florence kept going. "And maybe some of that is true," she admitted. "Maybe I am ambitious. Maybe I did want something bigger than selling books to neighborhood kids for minimum wage." She paused. "But I also know something most of you don't." The room held its breath. "I know what it's like to be invisible," Florence said quietly, "to be the person nobody sees. The girl servers ignore at restaurants. The woman people talk over in meetings. The face in the crowd that power walks past without noticing." Her voice grew stronger. "And I know that every child growing up poor and invisible right now is looking at the world and wondering if there's any point in trying. Because they see how you treat people like me. They see the contempt, the dismissiveness, the assumption that poverty equals stupidity." Florence looked directly at Vincent. "So this literacy program isn't about charity," she continued. It's about proving that knowledge is power long before money ever arrives, that invisible people can become undeniable if they refuse to stay quiet. The ballroom was so silent you could hear the cameras clicking. Florence gripped the microphone tighter. "Most of you inherited your power," she said. "Your families, your connections, your wealth. You were born into rooms like this one." She gestured to the glittering ballroom. "I had to claw my way here alone," Florence whispered, "so forgive me if I don't apologize for taking up space I wasn't supposed to occupy." Then she stepped back from the microphone. The ballroom erupted, not in polite applause, in thunderous, genuine, standing ovation-level applause. Even people who'd mocked her earlier were on their feet. Because Florence hadn't just given a speech, she'd declared war. And everyone in that room knew it. Damien pulled her close and kissed her forehead while cameras flashed like lightning. But Florence barely noticed, because across the ballroom, Vivian DeLuca was staring at her with an expression that could murder. And Florence realized something terrifying. She'd just made an enemy far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Ticket. The networking hour after the speeches was chaos. Everyone wanted to talk to Florence. Foreign ambassadors approached her in French and Italian. Tech billionaires asked about her Mandarin fluency. Journalists requested interviews. Even people who'd ignored her at dinner suddenly acted like they'd been supportive all along. Florence smiled politely and deflected most of it, but she could feel the shift. She was no longer the bookstore girl. She was the mafia boss's wife who'd just intellectually dominated an entire ballroom, and that came with consequences. Damien stayed close, his hand on her lower back, his presence a constant reminder that anyone who crossed her would answer to him, but even he couldn't protect her from everything. Around 10 p.m., Florence excused herself to get some air. The ballroom's balcony overlooked Manhattan, a glittering sprawl of lights and ambition and cruelty. She leaned against the railing and let the cold night air fill her lungs. That was quite a performance. Florence turned. Marcus Chen stood in the doorway holding 2 glasses of champagne. He offered her one. "I don't drink champagne," Florence said. "Smart." Marcus set both glasses on a nearby table. "Expensive doesn't always mean good." He moved to stand beside her at the railing. "You made a lot of people uncomfortable tonight," Marcus said. "That wasn't my intention." "Wasn't it?" Florence looked at him. Marcus Chen was harder to read than most people in Damien's world. He smiled easily, but his eyes stayed cold. He made jokes, but nothing about him felt relaxed. "What do you want?" Florence asked directly. "To give you some advice." "I didn't ask for advice." "No," Marcus agreed. "But you're going to get it anyway." He turned to face her fully. "You just humiliated some of the most powerful people in this city," Marcus said quietly. "People who control billions of dollars, political careers, criminal enterprises. People who destroy anyone who makes them look weak." Florence's stomach tightened. "Vincent Carrington has connections to 3 different cartels," Marcus continued. "Vivian DeLuca has enough blackmail material to ruin half the politicians in this room. Senator Owens has made people disappear for less than what you did tonight." "Are you threatening me?" Florence asked. "I'm warning you." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Damien can protect you from violence, from physical threats, from obvious enemies." He paused. "But he can't protect you from the subtle destruction," Marcus whispered. "The whisper campaigns, the coordinated social exclusion, the carefully orchestrated rumors that destroy reputations slowly enough that you don't notice until it's too late." Florence's hands tightened on the railing. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I actually respect what you did tonight," Marcus said. "Most people would have played it safe, stayed small, let Damien do all the talking." He smiled. "But you chose war instead." "I chose honesty." "In this world, that's the same thing." Marcus turned to leave. "Be careful, Florence," he said over his shoulder. "You just proved you're not weak. Now they're going to try twice as hard to break you." He walked back inside, leaving Florence alone with Manhattan and the cold realization that everything had just changed. She'd wanted to prove she belonged. Instead, she'd proven she was dangerous. And in Damien Moretti's world, dangerous people didn't last long. Tamuts. Florence found Damien near the bar talking to a group of investors about real estate developments that were definitely money laundering schemes. She touched his elbow gently. Damien immediately excused himself and turned his full attention to her. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Can we leave?" Florence whispered. Damien studied her face for 2 seconds, then nodded. They made their exits quickly, thanking the right people, promising follow-ups, acting like everything was perfectly fine. But the moment they got into Damien's car, Florence's composure cracked. "I fucked up," she said. Damien looked at her sharply. "What?" "I shouldn't have given that speech. I shouldn't have confronted Vincent. I shouldn't have—" "Florence!" Damien grabbed her hands. "You were incredible tonight." "I made enemies." "You made an impression. That's not the same thing." Damien pulled her close. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "Every person in that ballroom has spent years underestimating you. Tonight you showed them exactly who you are. That's not a mistake. That's power." Florence's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "What if I can't handle this?" she whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough for your world?" Damien tilted her chin up. "You stood on a stage in front of 300 predators and declared yourself undeniable," he said quietly. "If that's not strength, I don't know what is." He kissed her forehead. "And anyone who tries to destroy you will have to go through me first." Florence wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Damien's protection was enough. But Marcus Chen's warning echoed in her mind. He can't protect you from the subtle destruction. The car pulled up to their penthouse. Damien helped her out, and they rode the private elevator in silence. But when they reached their floor, Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his entire expression went dark. "What?" Florence asked. Damien showed her the phone. It was a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words and a photo. "She doesn't belong." The photo showed Florence at the gala, but someone had photoshopped her face onto a maid's uniform. Florence's blood went cold. "Who sent this?" she whispered. "I don't know." Damien's voice was deadly quiet. "But I'm going to find out." He started making phone calls immediately. Rapid, furious conversations in Italian demanding investigations, surveillance footage, digital forensics. Florence walked to the window and stared out at the city. She thought tonight was a victory. But victories in Damien's world came with costs, and she was just beginning to understand how high the price might be. Behind her, Damien's voice grew colder with each phone call. Someone had declared war on his wife, and Damien Moretti had just decided to burn down everyone who'd ever looked at Florence wrong. Florence pressed her forehead against the glass. She'd stepped into the spotlight tonight, and now she couldn't hide anymore. For better or worse, she'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. The bookstore girl from Brooklyn was gone, and whoever she was becoming terrified her more than anything. Damien made 17 phone calls in the first hour. Florence sat on the leather couch in their penthouse living room watching her husband transform into something she'd never seen before. Not the controlled businessman who negotiated million-dollar deals over whiskey. Not the dangerous crime lord who made people disappear with a single phone call. This was something rawer, more violent. Damien paced the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows like a caged predator, speaking rapid Italian into his phone with a voice that could shatter glass. His free hand clenched and unclenched rhythmically. His jaw was so tight Florence could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. She'd seen him angry before, but this was different. This was personal. "I don't care what it costs," Damien snarled into the phone. "I want to know who sent that photo. I want their digital footprint, their bank records, their fucking grocery receipts, and I want it by morning." He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Florence stood slowly. "Damien, not now." His voice was ice. "Damien, stop!" He ignored her and kept talking into the phone in clipped, furious sentences that made whoever was on the other end sound terrified. Florence crossed the room and grabbed the phone out of his hand. Damien spun around with an expression so dangerous it would have made most people step back. Florence didn't move. "Stop," she said firmly. "Give me the phone, Florence." "No." "Florence, you're spiraling." She set the phone on the table beside them. "And it's not going to help." Damien's hands trembled slightly. "Someone threatened you," he said quietly. "Someone looked at my wife and decided she was a target. That doesn't just get ignored." "I'm not asking you to ignore it." Florence touched his chest. "I'm asking you not to become a monster because of it." Damien grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but desperately. "Do you understand what that photo means?" he whispered. "It means someone in that ballroom tonight is planning to destroy you, and if I don't find them first, then we deal with it together." Florence cupped his face. "But you burning down half of New York won't protect me. It'll just prove everyone right." "About what?" "That you're exactly the kind of man who loses control over a woman." Damien flinched like she'd slapped him, because she was right. Every enemy he'd ever had was waiting for exactly this moment. The moment Damien Moretti cared about something more than power. And Florence had just become his greatest weakness. Damien pulled away and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. "I can't lose you," he said so quietly Florence almost didn't hear it. "You won't." "You don't know that." Damien's voice cracked. "My world destroys everything I touch. Everyone I care about either betrays me or gets hurt because of me. And now I've dragged you into this, and Damien." Florence moved behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "I chose this. I chose you. Nobody forced me." She felt his breathing slow slightly. "But if you want to protect me," Florence whispered against his back, "then teach me how to protect myself. Don't just build walls around me. Show me how to fight." Damien turned around. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "You want to learn how to survive my world?" he asked. "No." Florence met his gaze. "I want to learn how to conquer it." Something shifted in Damien's expression, something dark and fascinated and terrified. Because his wife wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking to become dangerous. The photo was just the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, the attacks escalated. Anonymous social media accounts started posting doctored images of Florence in compromising positions with other men. Tabloid websites ran stories questioning the legitimacy of the marriage. Gossip columns published anonymous sources, claiming Florence had been a high-end escort before meeting Damien. None of it was true. All of it was coordinated. Florence stopped reading the headlines after the first morning, but she couldn't stop the damage. Her phone exploded with texts from people she hadn't spoken to in years, some supportive, most curious, a few outright vicious. Old coworkers from the bookstore sent her screenshots of articles with passive-aggressive messages about staying grounded. Her college roommate called asking if the rumors were true. Even her mother called from Florida sounding worried and confused. Florence handled each conversation with terrifying calm, but inside she was unraveling. Damien's security team traced the photo back to a burner phone purchased with cash in Queens. Dead end. The fake social media accounts used VPNs and encrypted servers. Another dead end. Whoever was orchestrating this knew exactly how to stay invisible. And that scared Florence more than anything, because invisible enemies were the most dangerous kind. On the fourth day after the gala, Florence received a package. It arrived at the penthouse addressed to Mrs. Moretti in elegant handwriting. Damien's security team scanned it for explosives, biological threats, tracking devices. Nothing. Just a small box wrapped in black paper. Florence opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. Not doctored, not fake, real. It showed Florence and Damien at a restaurant 6 months ago, back when they were still secretly seeing each other, before the marriage, before any of this went public. The photo captured them at a small Italian place in Brooklyn where nobody knew who Damien was. Florence was laughing at something he'd said, and Damien was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. It was a private moment, intimate, and someone had been watching them. Florence's hand shook as she turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same elegant handwriting, "I know everything." That's when Florence realized something terrifying. This wasn't about jealousy. This wasn't about embarrassing her at a gala. This was about control. Someone had been watching them for months, planning, waiting, and now they were making their move. Florence showed the photo to Damien without saying a word. His face went completely blank. That blank expression was worse than anger, because it meant Damien had just shifted from protective husband to something far more dangerous. "I'm calling Marcus," he said quietly. "Why Marcus?" "Because he's the only person I trust to tell me the truth." Bastet. Marcus Chen arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes later. He walked in wearing a tailored suit and an expression that suggested he already knew why he'd been summoned. Damien handed him the photo without preamble. Marcus studied it for a long moment. Then he looked at Florence. "When was this taken?" he asked. 6 months ago, Florence replied. "Before we were married. Before anyone knew we were together." Marcus nodded slowly. "This is professional," he said. "Expensive surveillance, probably multiple operatives. Whoever hired them has serious resources." "Who?" Damien's voice was deadly quiet. Marcus set the photo down carefully. "That's the wrong question," he said. "What's the right question?" "What do they want?" The room went silent. Florence felt ice spreading through her chest. "This isn't about destroying Florence's reputation," Marcus continued. "If that was the goal, they would have released this photo weeks ago when it would have stopped the marriage entirely." He looked at Damien. "They're waiting for something," Marcus said. "Building pressure, forcing you into a position where you'll make a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Florence asked. Marcus turned to her. "The kind where Damien chooses between protecting you and protecting his empire." Damien's fists clenched. "That's not a choice I'm willing to make," he said. "Then you need to find out who's behind this before they force your hand." Marcus moved toward the door. "And you need to do it fast." After Marcus left, Florence and Damien stood in silence. The photograph lay on the table between them like evidence at a crime scene. "I'm going to fix this," Damien said finally. "How?" "By doing what I should have done from the beginning." His expression hardened. "I'm going to make an example out of someone." Florence grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what they want," she said. "They want you angry. They want you reckless. They want you to prove you're the monster everyone says you are." "Maybe I am." "No." Florence stepped in front of him. "You're the man who fell in love with a bookstore worker because she treated you like a human being. Don't let them take that away." Damien's jaw worked silently. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. Florence took a breath. "We stop reacting," she said, "and we start hunting." The next morning, Florence did something she'd never done before. She went to see Damien's mother. Francesca Moretti lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut, all ivy-covered walls and old money, and the kind of generational wealth that made new fortunes look cheap. She'd refused to attend the wedding, refused to meet Florence, refused to acknowledge that her son had married someone she considered beneath their family. But Florence didn't care about any of that anymore, because Francesca Moretti was one of the most connected women in New York's criminal underworld. And if anyone knew who was targeting Florence, it would be her. The housekeeper let Florence into a sitting room that looked like it belonged in a European castle. Everything was antique, expensive, and deliberately intimidating. Francesca appeared 10 minutes later wearing a cream cashmere sweater and pearls that probably cost more than a small car. She was 73 but looked 60. Sharp. Elegant. Absolutely terrifying. She looked at Florence like she was examining something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. "So," Francesca said, sitting down across from her, "my son's wife finally decides to visit." "I need your help," Florence said directly. Francesca's eyebrow raised. "Interesting." She poured herself tea from a silver service. "Most people spend at least 20 minutes on pleasantries before asking me for favors." "I don't have 20 minutes." "No," Francesca agreed. "I imagine you don't." She sipped her tea slowly. "Someone is targeting me," Florence continued. "Doctored photos, anonymous accounts, coordinated attacks, and now surveillance photos proving they've been watching us for months." Francesca's expression didn't change. "And you think I can help you?" she asked. "I think you know everyone in this city who has the resources to orchestrate something like this." "Perhaps." Francesca set down her teacup. "But why would I help the woman who trapped my son into a marriage that destroyed his reputation?" Florence's hands tightened in her lap. "I didn't trap him," she said quietly, "and you know that." "Do I?" "Yes." Florence met her eyes. "Because if I was actually a gold digger, I would have hired the best lawyers in New York and demanded a prenup that protected my interests. Instead, I signed the agreement Damien's attorneys drafted without changing a single word." Francesca's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't marry your son for money," Florence continued. "I married him because he's the first man who ever looked at me and saw something other than what I could provide." She leaned forward. "And I know you hate me," Florence said. "I know you think I'm unworthy of him. But right now, someone is trying to destroy me. And when they finish with me, they'll go after Damien, because that's how this works. Francesca was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was a cold smile. Calculating. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Francesca said. Does that mean you'll help me? It means I'll consider it. Francesca stood. Come with me. She led Florence through the estate to a private study filled with leather-bound books and paintings that were probably worth millions. Francesca pulled out a leather journal from a locked drawer. This contains names, she said. People who have reasons to hate my family. People with resources. People dangerous enough to orchestrate what you're describing. She handed the journal to Florence. But understand something, Francesca continued. If I give you this information, you owe me. What do you want? Prove you're worthy of my son. Francesca's expression hardened. Not by surviving these attacks. Anyone can survive. Prove you're strong enough to protect him when he's too proud to protect himself. Florence took the journal. I will, she said. Francesca studied her for 3 long seconds, then nodded once. Good, she said, because if you fail, I'll destroy you myself. Bad. The journal contained 47 names. Florence spent the next 6 hours cross-referencing each one with the attacks she'd experienced. Most didn't fit. Too old. Too disconnected. Too obvious. But 3 names kept appearing in overlapping circles. Vincent Carrington, the nightclub owner Florence had embarrassed at the gala. Vivian DeLuca, the socialite who'd threatened her in the bathroom. And Senator Patricia Owens, the politician who'd sat silently at dinner while everyone else mocked Florence. All 3 had motive. All 3 had resources. All 3 had been at the gala. But only one of them made sense. Florence called Damien. I think I know who it is, she said. Who? Senator Owens. Damien was quiet for a moment. Why her? He asked. Because she's the only one with something to lose, Florence replied. Vincent and Vivian want revenge, but revenge is emotional. This attack is calculated, professional, political. She pulled up news articles on her laptop. Senator Owens is up for re-election in 6 months, Florence continued, and she's been losing ground to a progressive challenger who's been hammering her on corruption charges. What does that have to do with you? Everything. Florence's fingers flew across the keyboard. Her campaign has been trying to distance her from organized crime connections. But she's taken money from your foundation for years. If that becomes public, she loses the election, Damien finished. Exactly. Florence pulled up a photograph from the gala. But if she can prove that the Moretti Foundation is being run by someone unstable or unqualified, then she can claim she was deceived, Damien said, and distance herself from us entirely. Florence felt the pieces clicking into place. She's not trying to destroy me for revenge, she whispered. She's trying to destroy me to save her political career. Fuck. Damien's voice went cold. I'm coming home. No. Florence stood up. I'm handling this. Florence, trust me. She ended the call before he could argue. Then she made another call. To Senator Patricia Owens's private number. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. This is Senator Owens. This is Florence Moretti, Florence said calmly, and we need to talk. Silence. Then a quiet laugh. Mrs. Moretti, the senator said, what a pleasant surprise. Cut the bullshit. Florence's voice was ice. I know you've been behind the attacks, the photos, the rumors, all of it. More silence. That's quite an accusation, Senator Owens replied carefully. It's not an accusation, it's a fact. Florence pulled up the surveillance photo on her laptop. And unless you want me to release evidence of your involvement to every media outlet in New York, you're going to meet me in person. And why would I do that? Because I have something you want. Which is? Florence smiled coldly. A way out. The senator was quiet for a long moment. Where? She asked finally. Washington Square Park. Tomorrow. Noon. That's very public. Exactly. Florence's grip tightened on her phone. Come alone or I go to the press. She ended the call. Her hands were shaking, but she'd just done something irreversible. She She'd declared war on a United States senator, and there was no coming back from that. Yet, Florence didn't tell Damien about the meeting. She knew he'd try to stop her, or worse, he'd insist on coming with her, and this was something Florence needed to do alone. The next morning, she dressed carefully. Simple black pants, white shirt, her wedding ring. No armor except her own mind. She took a car to Washington Square Park and arrived 15 minutes early. The park was crowded with students, tourists, street performers. Exactly what Florence wanted. Witnesses everywhere. Safety in numbers. Senator Owens arrived exactly at noon wearing designer sunglasses and a coat that probably cost $5,000. She sat down beside Florence on a bench beneath the arch without acknowledging her. For 2 full minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Senator Owens broke the silence. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid," she said. "I've heard that before," Florence replied. The senator smiled thinly. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to stop," Florence said simply. "Stop what?" "The attacks. The photos. The coordinated destruction of my reputation." Senator Owens turned to look at her directly. "And why would I do that?" she asked. "Because I'm offering you something better than my destruction," Florence replied. "Which is?" Florence pulled out a folder from her bag. Inside were financial records, campaign donations, offshore account transfers, all of it linking Senator Owens to shell companies controlled by the Moretti Empire. The senator's expression didn't change, but Florence saw her jaw tighten. "Where did you get these?" she asked quietly. "Damien's mother." Florence set the folder on the bench between them. "She keeps very detailed records." "This is blackmail." "No." Florence's voice was steel. "This is negotiation." She leaned closer. "You want distance from the Moretti Foundation," Florence said. "Fine, I'll give it to you. We'll issue a public statement severing all ties. You'll never have to associate with us again. And in exchange, you stop trying to destroy me." Florence's eyes were cold. "And you make sure whoever you hired to surveil us disappears permanently." Senator Owens studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "People keep saying that." The senator picked up the folder and flipped through the document slowly. "These could ruin me," she said. "I know. But releasing them would also expose your husband's criminal enterprise." "I know that too." Florence met her eyes. "Which is why this works. Mutually assured destruction. You leave me alone, I leave you alone. Everyone survives." Senator Owens closed the folder. "And if I refuse," she asked, "then I release everything to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and CNN simultaneously," Florence said calmly. "Your career ends. Your political allies abandon you, and you spend the rest of your life being investigated by every federal agency that exists." The senator's expression hardened. "You're making an enemy of a very powerful woman," she said. "I'm already your enemy." Florence stood. "I'm just giving you a chance to walk away." She started to leave. "Florence." Florence turned around. Senator Owens stood slowly. "You won," she said quietly. "Congratulations." She walked away without another word. Florence watched her disappear into the crowd. Then her legs gave out and she had to sit back down on the bench because her entire body was trembling. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd gone up against a United States senator and won. But the victory felt hollow, because Florence had just learned something terrifying about herself. She was good at this, at manipulation, at leverage, at the kind of cold, calculated cruelty that Damien's world demanded. And that realization made her feel sick, because she'd spent her entire life trying not to become the kind of person who used power as a weapon. But here she was, using it anyway. Florence pulled out her phone and called Damien. He answered on the first ring. "It's done," she said quietly. "What's done?" "Senator Owens, I handled it." Silence. "What did you do?" Damien's voice was careful. "What you would have done," Florence whispered. "I made her an offer she couldn't refuse." More silence. "Florence, I need you to come get me," she interrupted. "I'm at Washington Square Park and I don't think I can drive right now." "I'm on my way." The line went dead. Florence sat on that bench for 20 minutes waiting for Damien. People walked past her, joggers, students, families, normal people living normal lives. And Florence realized she'd never be one of them again. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. When Damien finally arrived, he pulled her into his arms without asking questions. "Let's go home," he whispered. Florence nodded against his chest, but as they walked back to the car, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She opened the text. Well played, but you forgot about one person. Attached was a photograph, not of Florence, of Damien, in a restaurant, with another woman. 6 months before he met Florence. The woman in the photo was beautiful, elegant, clearly comfortable in Damien's world. And they were holding hands across the table. Florence's blood went cold, because the timestamp on the photo was from exactly 1 week before Damien walked into her bookstore. 1 week before he claimed he'd never felt this way about anyone. 1 week before everything. Florence stopped walking. Damien turned around. "What's wrong?" he asked. Florence showed him the phone. Damien's face went completely white. "Florence, who is she?" Florence's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not what it looks like." "Who is she?" The words came out louder than Florence intended. People on the sidewalk turned to stare. Damien grabbed her arm gently. "Not here," he said. "Please, let me explain at home." Florence pulled away. "Explain now," she demanded. Damien's jaw tightened. "Her name is Elena," he said quietly. "She was someone I was seeing before I met you." "Seeing?" "Dating. Casually. It wasn't serious." Florence looked at the photo again, at their joined hands, at the way Damien was looking at this woman. "That doesn't look casual," she whispered. "It was complicated." "Was she at the gala?" Damien didn't answer. Florence's stomach dropped. "She was there," Florence said. "She watched me give that speech. She watched everyone mock me. And you didn't tell me. Because it didn't matter. It matters to me!" Florence's voice cracked. Tears streamed down her face. "You let me walk into that ballroom thinking I was fighting strangers," she continued. "But I wasn't. I was fighting someone who wanted you back. Someone who knew exactly how to destroy me." Damien reached for her. "Florence, please." She stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Damien called after her, but Florence didn't stop. She just kept walking. Down the sidewalk, through the crowds, away from the man she'd given up everything for. Because Florence had just realized something worse than betrayal. She'd become exactly the kind of person she'd always hated. Cold, manipulative, willing to use cruelty as currency, and the man she'd sacrificed herself for had been lying to her the entire time. Florence found herself in a subway station without remembering how she got there. She sat down on a bench and stared at the photograph on her phone. Damien and Elena. Looking happy. Looking real. Looking like everything Florence thought she had with him. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Now you understand. He'll always choose his world over you. Leave while you still can." Florence's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. Because whoever sent this wasn't trying to destroy her reputation anymore. They were trying to destroy her completely. And it was working. Florence rode the subway for 2 hours without knowing where she was going. The train rattled through tunnels beneath Manhattan while strangers pressed against her on all sides. Nobody recognized her down here. Nobody cared that she was the mafia boss's wife who'd just had her world shattered into pieces she couldn't put back together. She was just another woman crying on the F train. The phone in her hand felt like a grenade. The photograph of Damien and Elena burned into her retinas every time she closed her eyes. His hand covering hers. That smile. That goddamn smile Florence thought belonged only to her. Her phone buzzed again. Damien calling for the 7th time. Florence declined and turned off her phone completely. She needed silence, needed to think, needed to figure out who the hell she'd become and how she'd gotten here. The train lurched to a stop at West 4th Street. Florence got off without planning to. She walked up the stairs into the cold November air and found herself standing outside the bookstore where she used to work. The place looked exactly the same. Faded awning, cracked sidewalk, window display featuring poetry collections nobody would buy. Through the glass, Florence could see her replacement, a college kid with headphones organizing the front table. That was her life 6 months ago. Minimum wage, student loans, a tiny studio apartment with a radiator that only worked half the time. Simple. Poor. Safe. Florence pressed her palm against the window. She'd traded all of that for penthouse views and designer clothes, and a man who looked at her like she was salvation wrapped in human skin. And for what? To become someone who blackmailed senators and manipulated enemies and stood on stages performing her trauma for 300 predators? To marry a man who'd been lying to her from the very beginning? Florence's reflection stared back at her from the bookstore window. She barely recognized herself anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket even though she'd turned it off. No, not her phone. A different phone. Florence pulled out a second device she didn't remember having. It was an iPhone with a cracked screen and a sticky note attached to the back. Check your coat pocket. Florence's heart stopped. Someone had slipped this into her jacket. On the subway. In the crowd. While she was too broken to notice, her hand shook as she unlocked the phone. There was only one app installed, a messaging program she didn't recognize, and one conversation thread. From Elena. Florence's blood went ice cold. The first message was time-stamped from 3 hours ago. Florence, we need to talk. Meet me at Pier 45, midnight. Come alone. The second message was an address. The third was a photograph, not of Damien this time, of Florence herself, walking out of Francesca Moretti's estate yesterday. Florence's breath caught in her throat. Someone had been following her, photographing her, tracking every move she made, and now Elena, the woman Damien had been with before Florence, wanted to meet. Every rational part of Florence's brain screamed this was a trap. Don't go. Call Damien. Call the police. Get somewhere safe. But the irrational part, the part that had just discovered her husband had been lying to her, wanted answers. Wanted to look the woman in that photograph in the eyes. Wanted to understand what the hell was actually happening. Florence checked the time. 7:43 p.m., 4 hours until midnight. She looked at her reflection in the bookstore window one more time. Then she made a decision that would either save her or destroy her completely. She was going to that pier. Alone. Florence spent the next 3 hours preparing, not the way Damien would have prepared, with bodyguards and weapons and exit strategies. She prepared the only way she knew how, with research. She went to a library in the East Village and used a public computer to search everything she could find about Elena Marchetti. The woman's digital footprint was surprisingly sparse. No social media, no public photographs except a few society page mentions from charity events 3 years ago. But what Florence did find made her stomach drop. Elena Marchetti was the daughter of Antonio Marchetti, one of the most powerful crime lords in Italy. She'd been educated in Switzerland, spoke 6 languages, had a degree in international finance from Oxford, and according to one archived article from an Italian newspaper, she'd been engaged to Damien Moretti 4 years ago. Engaged. Not casually dating, not some passing relationship. Engaged. Florence read the article 3 times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. The engagement had been broken off suddenly with no public explanation. Both families refused to comment, and Elena had disappeared from public view entirely, until 6 months ago, when she'd apparently resurfaced in New York, right before Damien walked into Florence's bookstore. Florence's hands trembled as she printed the article. Everything Damien had told her was a lie. Their meeting wasn't fate. Their connection wasn't unique. She wasn't the first woman who'd made him feel human. She was just the replacement for someone he couldn't have. Florence felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart breaking. Something colder, harder. The part of her that had been trying desperately to stay soft in a world designed to make her cruel. That part shattered completely. And what rose from the wreckage was someone Florence didn't recognize. Someone capable of walking into a trap at midnight just to watch her enemies bleed. Pier 45 sat at the edge of the Hudson River in a section of the waterfront that urban development had forgotten. Abandoned warehouses lined the street. Broken streetlights cast shadows that moved like living things. The only sound was water slapping against rotted wooden pilings. Florence arrived at 11:53 p.m. She'd taken 3 different taxis to make sure nobody followed her. Worn clothes she'd bought at a thrift store in Brooklyn. Left her wedding ring in a locker at Grand Central. Carried nothing except the burner phone and a canister of pepper spray she'd purchased at a bodega. The pier stretched into darkness like a pathway to hell. Florence walked slowly down the weathered planks. Her footsteps echoed. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air. Every survival instinct screamed at her to turn around, but she kept walking. At the end of the pier stood a figure, small, female, wearing a long black coat and heels that had no business being on a structure this unstable. Florence stopped 10 feet away. "Elena," she said. The woman turned around. Even in the darkness, Florence could see she was beautiful, not Instagram filter beautiful, old money European beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from generations of careful breeding and expensive maintenance. Elena looked at Florence with eyes that held absolutely no warmth. "Mrs. Moretti," she said. Her accent was Italian layered over British boarding school. "Thank you for coming." "Did I have a choice?" Elena smiled. "There's always a choice," she replied. "You chose to marry a man you didn't know. You chose to enter a world you didn't understand. You chose to believe you could survive on love alone." She took a step closer. "And now you're choosing to meet a stranger on an abandoned pier at midnight," Elena continued. "So tell me, Florence, do you always make such terrible decisions?" Florence's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" she asked. "The same thing you want." Elena pulled out her phone and showed Florence another photograph. This one showed Damien in what looked like his penthouse. But he wasn't alone. Elena was there, in his apartment, 3 weeks ago. While Florence had been planning the goddamn literacy program, Florence felt her entire world tilt sideways. "You've been seeing him," she whispered. "Of course I have." Elena's smile widened. "Did you really think Damien Moretti would marry a bookstore clerk because he fell in love? He told me, he told you what you needed to hear." Elena circled Florence slowly like a predator evaluating prey. "He told you that you were special, that you saw the real him, that you were different from every other woman in his life." She stopped directly in front of Florence. "But here's the truth," Elena whispered. "Damien needed a wife who looked good for the foundation. Someone innocent. Someone the media would eat up. Someone who could make him look like a reformed man instead of the monster he actually is." Florence's hands clenched. "And you were perfect," Elena continued. "Poor, smart, naive enough to believe his bullshit. He played you like a violin, Florence, and you performed beautifully. You're lying." "Am I?" Elena held up her phone again. This time the screen showed text messages between Damien and Elena, hundreds of them, going back months. Florence grabbed the phone and scrolled through the conversation with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Damien. She gave the speech exactly like we planned." Elena. "Good. The foundation needs someone like her, innocent, sympathetic." Damien. "I almost believe it myself sometimes." Elena. "Don't. We have a plan. Stick to it." Damien. "When can I see you?" Elena. "Soon. Be patient." The timestamps were from 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, 3 days ago. The most recent was from this morning. Damien. "Florence found out about the senator. She handled it herself." Elena. "She's more capable than we thought. That could be a problem." Damien. "Or an asset." Elena. "Don't get attached. Remember what we're building." Florence dropped the phone. Her vision blurred. Her knees buckled. Everything she'd believed for the past 6 months dissolved like sugar in acid. "Why are you showing me this?" Florence whispered. "Because I need you to understand something." Elena picked up her phone. "Damien and I have been planning this for over a year. The foundation, the marriage, all of it." She moved closer. "We were engaged 4 years ago," Elena explained. "Our families arranged it. A merger of 2 empires. It would have made us the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere." "What happened?" "I got pregnant." Florence's breath stopped. "Damien wasn't ready to be a father," Elena continued, her voice flat. "He wanted me to terminate the pregnancy. I refused. So he called off the engagement publicly, humiliated me in front of both our families." Her eyes went dead. "I lost the baby 3 months later," she whispered, "and Damien never even called." Florence felt sick. "So you want revenge?" she said. "No," Elena smiled. "I want what I was promised. Power, status, the empire we were supposed to build together." She pulled out a gun. Florence froze. "And you're going to help me get it," Elena said calmly. How? By dying. The gun rose slowly until it pointed directly at Florence's chest. When they find your body tomorrow morning, Elena explained, it'll look like suicide. The pressure was too much, the attacks, the scandals. The poor girl from Brooklyn couldn't handle being married to a monster. Florence's pulse hammered in her throat. Damien will be devastated, Elena continued, guilty, vulnerable, and I'll be there to comfort him, just like I always have been. She cocked the gun. Within 6 months, we'll be married, Elena whispered, and you'll just be a tragic footnote in the Moretti family history. Florence's mind raced. She had seconds, maybe less. You won't get away with this, Florence said. Of course I will. Elena's finger moved to the trigger. I've gotten away with everything else. Damien will know it was you. Will he? Elena tilted her head. Or will he believe that the wife who ran away crying after discovering his lies couldn't bear the shame? Florence's hand slowly moved toward the pepper spray in her pocket. Goodbye, Florence, Elena whispered. The gunshot exploded across the pier like thunder, but Florence had already moved. She dove sideways as the bullet screamed past her ear and splintered the wooden railing behind her. Elena fired again. Miss! Florence rolled and came up with the pepper spray. She aimed and sprayed directly into Elena's face. Elena screamed. The gun clattered across the pier. Both women lunged for it simultaneously. Florence got there first, but Elena grabbed her wrist and twisted violently. Bones cracked. Florence screamed and dropped the weapon. Elena kicked it over the edge into the Hudson River. Then she grabbed Florence by the throat and slammed her against the pier railing. You stupid bitch, Elena snarled. You actually thought you could fight me? Florence clawed at Elena's hands. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The world started going dark around the edges. Elena's face was inches from hers. This is what happens to girls who don't know their place, Elena hissed. Florence's vision tunneled. Her lungs burned. This was it. She was going to die on a fucking pier at the hands of her husband's ex-fiancé. Then headlights exploded across the pier. Car doors slammed. Footsteps pounded against wood. Let her go! Damien's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Elena's grip loosened for half a second. Just enough. Florence drove her knee up into Elena's stomach as hard as she could. Elena doubled over. Florence shoved her away and collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Through blurred vision, she saw Damien running toward them. But he wasn't alone. Marcus Chen was with him, and 6 armed men who looked like they'd been pulled straight from a military operation. Elena stumbled backward toward the edge of the pier. Her face was a mask of rage and pepper spray tears. You called him, she spat at Florence. You lying whore! You called him! No, Florence gasped. I didn't. She looked at Damien. His face was white with terror and fury. I tracked your location, he said hoarsely. The moment you turned off your phone, I knew something was wrong. He moved between Florence and Elena like a wall made of violence. Damien, Elena said, her voice suddenly soft, pleading. Baby, please. She's lying to you. I was just trying to protect you from her. Shut your fucking mouth. The words came out so cold, Florence felt ice spread through her chest. Damien turned to Marcus without taking his eyes off Elena. Take her, he said quietly. 2 of the armed men moved forward. Elena backed up until she hit the pier railing. Damien, please, she begged. I did this for us, for what we were supposed to be. Don't you remember? Don't you remember what we had? What we had, Damien said, was a business arrangement our fathers forced on us when we were too young to know better. He took a step closer. And what you did tonight was try to murder my wife. Elena's expression shifted from desperate to venomous in half a second. She's not your wife, Elena hissed. She's a placeholder, a prop. You told me yourself she was just part of the plan. I lied. The words hung in the freezing air. Elena froze, Florence's breath caught. I lied to you for months, Damien continued. Let you think we still had a future. Let you believe I was using Florence. He moved closer to Elena. But the truth is I stopped caring about our plan the moment Florence looked at me like I was worth more than the empire I built. Elena's face crumpled. You loved me first, she whispered. No, Damien replied. I never loved you. I just didn't know what love was until I met her. He gestured to Florence. Elena looked at Florence with pure hatred. This isn't over, she said. Yes, Damien replied quietly. It is. He nodded to Marcus. The armed men grabbed Elena. She fought like a wild animal, but they were professionals. Within seconds, they had her restrained. Where are you taking her? Florence asked hoarsely. Damien didn't answer. He just looked at Marcus. And Marcus's expression told Florence everything she needed to know. Elena was about to disappear. Permanently. Wait, Florence said. Everyone froze. Florence stood slowly, her throat raw, her wrist throbbing, her entire body shaking. She walked over to Elena. The two women stared at each other. I'm sorry about your baby, Florence said quietly. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Fuck you, she whispered. Florence turned to Damien. Let her go, she said. Silence exploded across the pier. Damien stared at Florence like she'd lost her mind. She tried to kill you, he said slowly. I know. She's been orchestrating attacks against you for weeks. I know. Florence, let her go. Damien's jaw worked silently. Why? He asked. Florence looked at Elena one more time. At the broken woman who'd lost a child and a future and her entire sense of self in one terrible year. Because I'm not like you, Florence said quietly. And I won't become a monster just because your world demands it. She turned back to Damien. If you kill her, Florence continued, then every terrible thing anyone has ever said about you is true. You're exactly the kind of man who destroys people for crossing him. Her voice cracked. But if you let her go, she whispered, then maybe there's hope that you can actually be the person I thought you were. The pier went absolutely silent. Even the water seemed to stop moving. Damien stared at Florence for what felt like hours. Then he looked at Marcus. Let her go, he said quietly. Marcus's eyebrows raised. Boss, I said let her go. The armed men released Elena. She stumbled forward, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face. If I ever see you again, Damien said softly, I will kill you. Do you understand? Elena nodded. She looked at Florence one last time. You're going to regret this, she whispered. Then she ran. Her heels clicked against the pier until she disappeared into the darkness. Florence's legs finally gave out. She collapsed. Damien caught her before she hit the ground. He pulled her against his chest and held her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. I'm sorry, he whispered against her hair. I'm so fucking sorry. Florence couldn't respond, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She just cried into his chest while Manhattan glittered in the distance and the Hudson River whispered against the pier, and everything she'd thought she knew about her life dissolved into nothing. They drove back to the penthouse in silence. Florence sat in the back of Damien's car with her broken wrist cradled against her chest and her throat covered in bruises that were already turning purple. Damien sat beside her rigid as stone. Marcus drove. Nobody spoke. When they finally reached the penthouse, Damien's private doctor was already waiting, an older woman who'd clearly spent decades treating injuries nobody reported to hospitals. She examined Florence silently, wrapped her wrist, put ice on her throat, gave her painkillers, then left without asking a single question about what happened. After she was gone, Florence sat on the couch staring at nothing. Damien stood at the window with his back to her. The silence stretched until it felt like physical pain. Finally, Florence spoke. The text messages, she said. Her voice was hoarse, damaged. Between you and Elena. Were they real? Damien's shoulders tightened. Some of them, he admitted quietly. Florence's stomach dropped. I thought if I kept her close, Damien continued, I could control her, predict her, stop her before she did something drastic. He turned around. His eyes were red. I never touched her, he said. Not once since I met you. But I did lie. About seeing her, about the plan, about all of it. He moved closer. I told her you were part of a strategy, Damien whispered. I let her believe I was using you. Because I knew if she thought our marriage was real, she'd escalate. His voice cracked. And I almost got you killed anyway. Florence looked at him, really looked at him. The most dangerous man in New York, the untouchable mafia boss, standing in front of her looking more broken than she'd ever seen him. I need to know something, Florence said quietly. Anything. That night in the bookstore. Her throat tightened. When you asked me to translate those letters, was any of it real? Or was I always just part of the plan? Damien dropped to his knees in front of her. I walked into that bookstore planning to hire a translator, he said. Someone disposable. Someone I'd never see again. He took her uninjured hand. But then you looked at me like I was just some asshole interrupting your closing routine, Damien whispered. Not the monster, not the empire, just a person. Tears slid down his face. And I've spent every day since then falling more in love with you, he said. Everything else, the foundation, the marriage, the public appearances, all of that became real because you were real. Florence wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the man she'd married actually existed somewhere beneath the lies and violence and manipulation. But she'd just spent 3 hours being hunted by his ex-fiancé, just watched him almost order someone's execution without blinking, just learned that the fairy tale she'd been living was built on foundations of calculated deception. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Florence whispered. Damien's face crumpled. Please, he said, please don't leave me. You lied to me for months. I know. You let me walk into that gala thinking I was fighting strangers when I was fighting someone who wanted me dead. I know. You almost got me killed tonight. I know! The words exploded out of Damien like a wound bursting open. He buried his face against Florence's knees. I know what I did, he said brokenly. I know I fucked up. I know I don't deserve you. I know I'm exactly the monster everyone says I am. His shoulders shook. But you're the only thing in my entire life that's ever felt clean, Damien whispered. The only thing I haven't destroyed. The only person who looks at me and sees something worth saving. He looked up at her with eyes that held every terrible thing he'd ever done. So please, he begged, please don't give up on me yet. Florence stared at the man she'd married. The man who'd lied to protect her and almost killed her in the process. The man who controlled half of New York but couldn't control his own desperate need to be loved. The man who was capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary tenderness in the same breath. And Florence realized something that made her throat close up completely. She loved him anyway, despite everything, despite the lies and the danger and the absolute clusterfuck her life had become. She loved him. I need time, she said finally. Damien's breath caught. How much time? I don't know. Florence pulled her hand away gently. But I can't stay here right now. I can't be in this penthouse pretending everything is fine when my entire world just got torn apart. Where will you go? I don't know that either. She stood slowly. Her body ached everywhere. But I need space to figure out who I am when I'm not performing for your world, Florence said. And you need to figure out if you can actually be the man you claim to be. She walked toward the bedroom. Florence! She stopped, but didn't turn around. I love you, Damien whispered. That's the only thing I didn't lie about. Florence closed her eyes. I know, she said quietly. Then she went into the bedroom and started packing. And Damien Moretti, the man who controlled an empire built on fear and violence, stood alone in his living room and felt power slip through his fingers for the first time in his life. Because the only thing he'd ever truly wanted was walking away, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. Florence left the penthouse at 3 a.m. carrying one suitcase and the weight of 6 months compressed into a single night. Damien didn't try to stop her. He just stood at the window watching her get into the car Marcus had called, his reflection in the glass looking more like a ghost than a man. Florence told the driver to take her to Brooklyn, not to her old apartment. Someone else lived there now, not to the bookstore. That life was gone forever. She gave him the address of a small hotel near Prospect Park that charged by the week and didn't ask questions. The room was small and clean and smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner. Florence locked the door, set down her suitcase, and stood in the middle of the empty space for 5 full minutes. Then she walked into the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Purple bruises circled her throat like a necklace. Her wrist was wrapped in medical gauze. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She looked like someone who'd survived a war, and maybe she had. Florence turned on the shower as hot as it would go and stood under the water until her skin turned red and the steam made it impossible to breathe. She scrubbed her body until it hurt, washed her hair 3 times, tried to clean away the feeling of Elena's hands around her throat, and Damien's lies coating her skin, and the suffocating realization that she'd married a man she didn't actually know. When the water finally ran cold, Florence wrapped herself in a threadbare hotel towel and sat on the edge of the bed. Her phone had 17 missed calls from Damien, 12 text messages, 3 voicemails she couldn't bring herself to listen to. Florence turned off her phone and stared at the wall. She'd walked away from a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, from a man who controlled an empire, from a life most people would kill for, and she'd done it because staying would have cost her the only thing she had left, herself. Florence lay down on the hotel bed and closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come, just the sound of her own breathing and the distant hum of traffic and the terrible silence of being completely alone. The first week was the hardest. Florence stayed in that hotel room like it was a bomb shelter protecting her from the fallout of her own life. She ordered food delivery, avoided windows, didn't answer her phone. The bruises on her throat faded from purple to yellow-green. Her wrist healed enough that she could move it without wanting to scream. But the damage inside took longer. Every night, Florence dreamed about the pier, about Elena's hands around her throat, about Damien's face when she told him she needed time, about the moment she realized the man she loved was capable of ordering someone's death with the same casual tone he used to order coffee. And every morning, Florence woke up and had to decide whether she was brave enough to keep existing. On day 8, someone knocked on her hotel room door. Florence froze. "Who is it?" she called out. "Marcus Chen." Florence's stomach dropped. She opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock engaged. Marcus stood in the hallway wearing a suit that probably cost more than her entire hotel stay. He looked tired, but composed. "How did you find me?" Florence asked. "I'm very good at my job." Marcus held up his hand, showing he wasn't armed. "Can I come in?" Florence considered for 3 long seconds, then unlatched the chain. Marcus walked into the small room and looked around with an expression that revealed nothing. If he had any opinions about the mafia boss's wife living in a $70 a night hotel, he kept them to himself. "Damien didn't send me," Marcus said immediately. "In fact, he'd probably kill me if he knew I was here." "Then why are you here?" Marcus turned to face her. "Because someone needs to tell you the truth," he said quietly, "and everyone else in Damien's life is too afraid of him to do it." Florence crossed her arms. "What truth?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. It was Elena Marchetti, getting on a private plane. "I had her followed after we let her go," Marcus explained. "She flew to Rome, stayed there for 3 days, then disappeared completely." He swiped to another photo. This one showed Elena meeting with 2 men Florence didn't recognize. "These are Antonio Marchetti's top enforcers," Marcus continued. "Elena went crying to Daddy about what happened, and now there's a price on Damien's head." Florence's blood went cold. "How much?" she whispered. $5 million. Marcus put away his phone. "Every assassin, mercenary, and desperate criminal in the Western Hemisphere is now hunting the man you married." Florence sat down slowly on the bed. "Because I asked him to let her go," she said. "No." Marcus's voice was firm. "Because Damien chose to listen to you. That was his decision, his choice." He moved closer. "But you need to understand something," Marcus said quietly. "Mercy is expensive in our world, and the price for letting Elena live is now being paid in blood." Florence looked up at him. "Is he safe?" she asked. "For now." Marcus's expression darkened. "But only because he's locked himself in the penthouse with enough security to protect a head of state. He's not eating, not sleeping, not running his businesses." He paused. "He's destroying himself," Marcus whispered. "And if you don't come back, I don't think there'll be anything left to save." Florence's throat tightened. "I can't go back," she said. "Why not?" "Because I don't know if I can love someone who's capable of the things he's done." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair across from her. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. Florence nodded. "I've known Damien for 15 years, Marcus said. Watched him build an empire out of violence and fear. Seen him do things that would make most people vomit." He leaned forward. "But I've never seen him love anything," Marcus continued. "Not his businesses, not his power, not even his own life." His eyes met Florence's. "Until you," he whispered. You're the first thing he's ever cared about more than survival, and that terrifies him more than any assassin ever could. Florence felt tears sliding down her face. He lied to me, she said. Yes. He almost got me killed. Yes. He's a monster. Marcus smiled sadly. Yes, he agreed. But he's a monster trying desperately to become human for you, and maybe that's worth something. He stood to leave. I'm not telling you what to do, Marcus said at the door, but I think you need to decide something soon. Decide what? Whether you love the man Damien is trying to become, Marcus replied, or whether you can't forgive the man he's been. He left before Florence could respond, and she sat alone in that hotel room facing the most important decision of her life. Florence spent 2 more days thinking. She walked through Prospect Park, watching couples hold hands, and families push strollers and old men play chess on concrete tables. Normal people living normal lives. Lives that would never include assassination attempts or crime empires, or husbands who controlled half a city through fear. Florence could have that life. Could disappear into Brooklyn and find a new bookstore job and eventually meet someone stable and boring and safe. Someone who'd never make her give speeches at galas or negotiate with senators or face down ex-fiancés with guns. It would be easier, simpler, safer. But on the 3rd day, Florence realized something that changed everything. She didn't want easy anymore, because somewhere between translating blood-stained contracts and standing on stages and surviving attempts on her life, Florence had discovered something terrifying about herself. She liked being powerful, liked the way people listened when she spoke, liked the feeling of facing down enemies and winning, liked being dangerous. And the only person who'd ever seen that darkness in her and loved her anyway was Damien Moretti. Florence went back to the hotel and started packing. Amak. The penthouse looked different when Florence returned. Darker somehow. Like the light had been drained out of it, along with hope. Security let her up without question. They'd clearly been told she might come back. The elevator doors opened directly into the living room. Damien stood at the window where Florence had last seen him 10 days ago. He didn't turn around when she entered. Marcus told you, Florence said quietly. He told me he was going to, Damien replied. His voice was hoarse, raw. I ordered him not to. He did it anyway. Are you going to kill him for it? No. Damien finally turned around. Because he saved my life. Florence set down her suitcase. Damien looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. His clothes were wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in them. He looked like a man who'd been drowning for 10 days straight. You came back, he whispered. I did. Why? Florence walked across the room until she stood directly in front of him. Because I spent 10 days trying to figure out if I could forgive you, she said, and I realized I was asking the wrong question. Damien's jaw tightened. What's the right question? He asked. Whether I can forgive myself, Florence replied, for choosing you anyway. She touched his chest. I know who you are, she continued. I know what you've done. I know you're capable of violence and manipulation and things that would destroy most people. Her voice cracked. But I also know you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth destroying himself for, Florence whispered. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away from that. Damien grabbed her hand. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth staying for, he said desperately. I'll change. I'll be better. No. Florence shook her head. Don't change. Just be honest. She pulled out her phone and opened the photographs Elena had shown her. These conversations, Florence said. Were you lying to me or lying to her? Damien looked at the messages. Both, he admitted. I was lying to her about using you, and I was lying to you about cutting her off completely. He met Florence's eyes. I thought I could control the situation, Damien said. Thought I could keep Elena close enough to monitor and you safe enough to protect. But I was wrong. His voice broke. And I almost lost you because I was too arrogant to ask for help, he whispered. Florence studied his face, looking for lies, looking for manipulation, looking for any sign that this was another performance. But all she saw was exhaustion and fear and desperate, broken honesty. The contract on your head, Florence said. How do we fix it? Damien's expression hardened. We don't, he replied. I do. That's not how this works anymore. Florence, If I'm staying, she interrupted, then I'm not staying as your protected princess locked in a tower. I'm staying as your partner. She moved closer. So tell me, Florence said, how do we fix this? Damien stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, something that looked like respect mixed with terror. Antonio Marchetti won't call off the contract unless someone forces him to, he said finally, which means we need leverage. What kind of leverage? The kind that makes killing me more expensive than letting me live. Florence thought for 3 seconds. His daughter, she said. Damien's eyebrows raised. Elena? He asked. She's his only child, Florence replied. If something happened to her, he'd burn the world down, Damien finished. But she's disappeared. Nobody knows where she is. Florence smiled. It was a cold smile, a smile Damien had never seen on her face before. Then we find her, Florence said, and we make her the leverage. Finding Elena Marchetti took 3 days and cost more money than Florence wanted to think about. But Damien's network was extensive. Informants in Rome reported she'd been spotted in Switzerland. Surveillance footage showed her checking into a private clinic in Geneva. And medical records Marcus somehow obtained revealed she was pregnant. Florence stared at the report Marcus handed her. How far along? She asked. 8 weeks, Marcus replied. Florence's mind raced. 8 weeks. The timeline didn't match up with anything that happened on the pier, which meant Elena had been pregnant before all of this started. Who's the father? Florence asked. Marcus and Damien exchanged glances. We don't know, Marcus admitted. But it's not Damien. DNA analysis confirmed that. Florence looked at Damien. Did you sleep with her? She asked directly. After you met me? No, Damien said firmly. I swear on everything I am, no. Florence believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she'd learned to read Damien's lies. And this wasn't one of them. Then who? Florence wondered aloud. The answer came 2 hours later when Marcus's informant sent another photograph. Elena meeting with a man outside the Geneva clinic. Young, handsome, expensive suit. Florence didn't recognize him, but Damien did. His face went completely white. That's my cousin, he said quietly. Raphael Moretti. Silence exploded across the penthouse. Your cousin, Florence repeated slowly, has been sleeping with your ex-fiancé. And probably orchestrated this entire thing, Marcus added. The attacks, the surveillance, the pier. Damien's hands clenched into fists. Raphael's been trying to take over my territories for years, he said, but he's never had the resources or connections to challenge me directly. Until Elena gave them to him, Florence finished. The pieces fell into place like dominoes. Elena hadn't been acting alone. She'd been working with Raphael to destroy Damien from the inside. The plan was elegant and vicious. Discredit Florence. Force Damien to make mistakes. Create chaos in his empire. And when Damien was weak enough, Raphael would step in with Antonio Marchetti's backing and take everything. They're going to get married, Florence said quietly. Damien looked at her. What? Elena's pregnant with Raphael's child, Florence explained. If they get married, Raphael becomes part of the Marchetti family, which means he gets access to Antonio's resources and protection. She met Damien's eyes. And you become expendable, Florence whispered. Damien's expression went ice cold. Then we stop the wedding, he said. How? Damien smiled. It was the most dangerous smile Florence had ever seen. By giving Antonio Marchetti exactly what he wants, Damien replied. His daughter's happiness. The plan was insane, reckless, and absolutely brilliant. Florence would go to Geneva, alone. She'd meet with Elena under the pretense of negotiating a truce. And during that meeting, Florence would reveal the one thing Elena had been desperately hiding from her father, that Raphael Moretti, the man who'd gotten her pregnant, was already married, to a woman in Milan, with 2 children. Marcus had discovered the information buried in Italian municipal records. Raphael had married young to a woman from another crime family as part of a business arrangement. The marriage was essentially dead. They lived in different cities and hadn't seen each other in years, but legally, they were still married, which meant Raphael couldn't marry Elena. which meant Elena's child would be born out of wedlock, which meant Antonio Marchetti, traditional Italian patriarch who valued family legitimacy above everything, would never accept Raphael into the family. And without Antonio's protection, Raphael was just another small-time criminal Damien could crush without effort. "This is dangerous," Damien said for the 7th time. They were in his private jet flying toward Geneva. Florence sat across from him reviewing documents Marcus had prepared. "Everything we do is dangerous," Florence replied without looking up. "Elena tried to kill you once already, which is why I'm bringing insurance." Florence patted her bag where a recording device was hidden. "Everything she says will be transmitted directly to Marcus. If anything goes wrong, you'll know immediately." Damien leaned forward. "Florence," he said quietly, "I can't lose you." Florence finally looked up. "You won't," she said firmly, "because I'm done being the victim in this story. Elena made me a target. Now I'm making her a casualty." Damien stared at his wife, at the woman who'd walked into his life as a shy bookstore clerk and emerged as something far more dangerous. "When did you become so ruthless?" he asked. Florence smiled. "I married you," she replied. "What did you expect?" "This." The meeting happened in a private room at the Geneva clinic where Elena was receiving prenatal care. Neutral territory. Public enough to discourage violence. Private enough for honest conversation. Florence arrived wearing a simple black dress and no jewelry except her wedding ring. Elena was already waiting. She looked different than she had on the pier. Softer somehow. Pregnancy had rounded her features and added color to her cheeks. She looked almost human, until Florence met her eyes and saw the same cold hatred lurking beneath the surface. "Mrs. Moretti," Elena said. "What an unexpected surprise." Florence sat down across from her without being invited. "We need to talk," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life." Elena's expression didn't change. "And what mistake is that?" she asked. Florence pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Marrying Raphael Moretti," she said. Elena opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of marriage certificates, birth certificates, photographs of Raphael with his wife and children in Milan, all of it documented, all of it undeniable, all of it devastating. Elena's face went completely white. "He told me he was divorced," she whispered. "He lied," Florence replied, "which I'm sure isn't new information to you. People in our world lie constantly." She leaned forward. "But here's what's actually important," Florence continued. "Your father will never accept this child if it's born out of wedlock, and Raphael can't marry you without divorcing his current wife. He'll divorce her." "Will he?" Florence tilted her head. "His wife's family controls the ports in southern Italy. If Raphael divorces her, he loses access to billions of dollars in shipping infrastructure." She smiled coldly. "So he has a choice," Florence said. "Marry you and lose his business empire, or keep his marriage and abandon you." Elena's hands trembled. "What do you want?" she asked hoarsely. "I want you to call off the contract on Damien's life." "I can't do that. Your father will do whatever you ask him to do," Florence interrupted. "Because despite everything, he loves you. And if you tell him the truth about Raphael, he'll pull that contract so fast it'll make your head spin." Elena stared at the documents. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Florence pulled out her phone and showed Elena a photograph. It was Raphael, with his wife, and children, taken 3 days ago, looking like a happy family. "If you refuse," Florence said quietly, "I'll send these photos to your father myself, along with hospital records proving you're pregnant with Raphael's child." She leaned back. "Antonio will disown you," Florence continued. "Raphael will abandon you to protect his business interests. And you'll raise that child alone with nothing." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," Florence replied. "I'm just someone who learned from the best." She stood. "You have 24 hours to decide," Florence said. "Call off the contract or watch your entire life collapse." She walked toward the door. "Florence?" Florence stopped but didn't turn around. "How did you become like this?" Elena asked. Her voice was broken. "You were just a bookstore girl." Florence looked over her shoulder. "I married into a world that destroys weak people," she said quietly. "So I decided to stop being weak." Then she left. And Elena Marchetti sat alone in that clinic room surrounded by evidence of her own betrayal and realized she'd just lost a war she'd spent months planning. The contract was canceled within 18 hours. Antonio Marchetti personally called Damien to apologize for the misunderstanding and assure him the situation had been resolved. He never mentioned why, and Damien never asked. Raphael Moretti disappeared from New York 2 days later. Rumor was he'd been recalled to Italy to deal with some urgent family business. But everyone in Damien's world understood what actually happened. He'd been exposed, humiliated, and effectively neutralized as a threat. Elena stayed in Geneva. She never reached out to Florence again, and Florence never looked back. But 6 months later, Florence stood in a community center in Brooklyn watching 50 children receive their first books through the Moretti Global Literacy Program. The kids ranged from 6 to 12 years old, all from low-income families, all from neighborhoods the world had forgotten, all looking at those books like they were treasures instead of paper and ink. Florence watched a little girl with braids open a copy of The Little Prince and start reading the first page out loud. Her voice was hesitant but determined, and Florence remembered being that girl, broke, invisible, hungry for something bigger than the life she'd been given. "They love it," a voice said beside her. Florence turned. Damien stood watching the children with an expression she'd never seen before. Something soft, almost proud. "They do," Florence agreed. Damien slipped his hand into hers. "You built this," he said quietly. "All of it. The program, the funding, the partnerships with schools across 12 countries." He looked at her. "You changed thousands of lives," Damien whispered, "and you did it without compromising who you are." Florence squeezed his hand. "We did it," she corrected, "together." They stood in silence, watching the children. "Do you regret it?" Damien asked suddenly. "Everything that happened, the gala, Elena, the pier, all of it." Florence thought carefully. "I regret the pain," she said finally, "but I don't regret the person it turned me into." She turned to face him. "I spent my whole life being invisible," Florence continued, "being the girl people talked over and ignored and dismissed. And I was okay with that because it was safe." Her voice grew stronger. "But you made me visible," she said, "and that was terrifying and dangerous and almost killed me." She smiled. "But I'd rather be seen and survive than invisible and safe," Florence whispered. Damien pulled her close. "I love you," he said. "I know." Florence kissed him gently. "I love you too." They left the community center hand in hand as the Brooklyn sun set behind them, and the children inside discovered worlds they'd never known existed. That night, Florence and Damien sat in their private library while rain drummed against the windows and the city glowed beneath them. Florence was curled up on the couch reading poetry. Damien worked at his desk reviewing contracts for legitimate businesses he'd been slowly transitioning into. No more arms deals, no more blackmail, no more violence as currency. It would take years to fully extract himself from the criminal enterprises that built his empire. But he was trying. For her. "Damien," Florence said suddenly. He looked up. "Do you ever wish things were different?" she asked. "That you'd met me in another life. One where you weren't who you are." Damien set down his pen and crossed the room. He sat beside her on the couch. "No," he said firmly. "Why not?" "Because I wouldn't be me without everything I've done," Damien replied. "And you wouldn't be you without everything you survived." He touched her face gently. "We're both broken people who found each other in a broken world," he whispered. "And somehow, that made us whole." Florence felt tears slide down her cheeks. "The newspapers still call me a gold digger," she said. "Let them." "People still think I married you for money." "Let them think whatever they want." Damien kissed her forehead. "We know the truth." Florence leaned against him. "And what's that?" she asked. "That you married a monster," Damien said quietly, "and taught him how to be human." Outside, New York City spread beneath them like a kingdom built on secrets and violence and impossible love stories. Inside that library, Florence Hail and Damien Moretti sat together in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because some truths lived deeper than words. The world would always see him as a criminal, would always see her as the opportunist who married him, would never understand what it actually cost them to survive each other, But Florence had stopped caring what the world thought, because she'd learned something more important than reputation or acceptance or fitting into spaces designed to exclude her. She'd learned that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was refuse to stay small, refuse to apologize for taking up space, refuse to let other people's fear define the size of her life. The bookstore girl from Brooklyn was gone, and in her place stood someone Florence was still learning to recognize, someone powerful, someone dangerous, someone who'd looked directly into the eyes of the most feared man in New York and seen something worth saving. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. Florence closed her book and looked at Damien. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me," Florence whispered, "when nobody else did." Damien pulled her closer. "You were always worth seeing," he replied. "Everyone else was just too blind to notice." They sat together while the rain fell and the city breathed and the future stretched out before them, uncertain and dangerous and theirs. Because Florence had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Power wasn't something you inherited or stole or manipulated your way into. Real power was choosing who you became when the world tried to break you and refusing to let it win. The mafia boss and his wife would face more battles, more enemies, more nights questioning whether love was strong enough to survive the darkness they carried. But tonight, in that library overlooking Manhattan, they were simply two broken people who'd found each other against impossible odds and decided that was enough. Florence fell asleep against Damien's chest while he held her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. Outside, the city that once mocked her now whispered her name with something that looked almost like respect. Because the woman nobody saw coming had become undeniable, and she was just getting started.